can go ahead and get started. So it's probably been a minute or two since you've heard this, so I'll start with our disclaimer and that the presentations and information offered as part of this MS4 forum are the views and experiences of the organizations presenting. EPA and Pennsylvania DEP do not endorse any one approach or funding strategy. The views and the opinions expressed by the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not reflect those of the EPA or Pennsylvania DEP. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not indicate an EPA or Pennsylvania DEP endorsement. So we also want to thank all our speakers today, Mark and Tom, for presenting, and all of the speakers so far. We're grateful that they have taken their time to participate in the forum. And this event has been developed to focus on the permittees' experiences as they work to meet the conditions of the Pennsylvania MS4 permit. All of our presenters have volunteered this time to share this information to serve as a learning opportunity for their fellow permittees and local decision makers. So we thank Mark and Tom for the time today to share with us a little bit on verifying annual compliance of operation and maintenance for private BMPs. So Mark, I know that was a brief intro, not really an introduction at all. So if you and Tom would like to introduce yourselves, that would be great. Can you take it away?
Okay, thank you. First off, let me thank everybody for attending this morning. I'll apologize up front. I've got sinus issues going, and they're good enough to be trimming the trees out around my office. So that's the added bonus for today. But thank you for attending. Also like to give a thanks to EPA and DEP for allowing me the opportunity to talk. I think conversations like this are very helpful across the board. As previously noted, my name is Mark Harmon. I'm a geologist and an MS4 stormwater compliance professional with Arrow Consulting. I currently oversee 18 MS4 clients, so I do a variety of different work in a couple different states. So I have some experience with DEP as well as EPA, and hopefully I can bring some of that knowledge to the table to everybody today. I also have Tom Maka with me from the Dallas Area Municipal Authority. Tom is their in-house stormwater coordinator. When Tom and I were putting this program together, it quickly became apparent it was going to be difficult. There was a lot of content in a very short amount of time. So Tom agreed to let me kind of drive the ship today. This typically is a presentation I put on for, it's probably a good 60 minutes to 90 minutes with about a half hour of Q&A. So we're adding a lot in. I have Tom. We'll do Q&A at the end, and certainly if anybody has any questions for Tom, they can jump in. But I'm going to do my best to try to flow through all this material in about 30 minutes and provide about 10 minutes of Q&A. So I can just go ahead and jump in real quick. Let me go through our slides. I always start to just like to jump in with a few housekeeping items. I think prior to any presentation, it's helpful to have some context moving forward. So this is typically my first slide with a lot of these presentations. Today is not meant to be a technical discussion. The permits are out there. The permit guidance is available. I really want to keep it basic when it comes to the actual permit itself and the permit language. What I'm trying to do is really fly over at about 5,000 feet without getting bogged down on too many details, where we get overwhelmed and lose sight of what we're trying to achieve today. So today's all about understanding comments, concepts, and really understanding the intent of what we're trying to achieve when we're talking about BMP compliance, particularly on the private end. I know that gives a lot of folks heartburn. The next thing I want to note is the permit guidance. Ultimately, that really is guidance. There's no blanket or cookie cutter approach to what I'm going to outline today. The guidance is really intended, once you understand the concept, is to go back and fill in the gaps and make sure that you're compliant. But the concept is of the utmost importance. So if that's the one thing everybody walks away with today, I think I will have achieved my objective. Just a quick note, again, the difficulty with a lot of the MS4 program is it's based on local compliance issues, stream impairments, local land uses. how are illicit discharges being generated? And all of that really is going to vary from location to location. And that's the reason why there's permit guidance as opposed to a strict outline or a checklist to remain compliant, because what works in a built-out borough that's surrounded by ag lands is not going to be the same for, say, downtown Philadelphia. So again, we're really focusing on concepts. We use the permit guidance to fill the gap. So I'll touch a little bit on that. Finally, what I'm doing today is I'm not defining protocols as much as I'm providing information that has worked for Arrow. Some of the information that's been helpful to Tom and the Dallas Area Municipal Authority. And as I said, I've dealt with DEP, I've dealt with EPA on compliance issues, and these protocols have worked in order to guide my clients through compliance. And that's ultimately we're trying to achieve. So I don't want anybody to get the impression that I'm going to be presenting a checklist. I think once you understand the concept, and I'll keep using that word concept, of what I did to obtain compliance, you'll be able to work through the same process. And I think that that's another objective for today. So I'm going to try to keep an eye on my time as well. Today's presentation is really going to outline two components or two items. I really want everybody to understand what is required when we're talking about BMP documentation, whether we're talking about public, private, the requirements for that documentation. I think there's some confusion there. And then I'm going to sort of get into the meat of the presentation and talk about the methods that I've used to obtain compliance. Again, I'm going to share what has worked for me. We're going to finally end up with some Q&A. Hopefully, I'm going to provide as much time as possible for that. If there are no questions, I know the virtual can be difficult to interact, and we do have a limited amount of time. I'll have some contact information at the end of the presentation. Certainly feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help in any way that I can. And then I'm sure Tom, any information that I would need from him, he'd be more than happy to provide. So hopefully, if there are additional questions, again, don't feel like you're not going to get answers to your questions. So I'm going to start with the first item, and that's going to be what's required when we're talking about BMP documentation. If you're a first-year permit holder, you may not have this information documented, but you will be required to do it at the end of the first year. Most of the references that I'm going to talk about today are going to come from the general permit. I know a lot of folks have the individual permit. This information is still going to be relevant. And again, I'm not going to get too bogged down in a lot of the permit requirements. That information is readily available. And the information that I'm going to provide on the next two slides, I pulled from the general permit MCM 5 BMP 3 as a frame of reference for you. So the first thing that I like to discuss is what are we talking about when we talk about requirements for operation and maintenance of BMPs? And when I say BMPs, again, private and public are going to be exactly the same. I will try to keep saying private so that really hits that point home. But when we're talking about the private BMPs, the first question comes up is, what exactly are you looking for? And the permit, the general permit's fairly clear. Again, there's going to be some perimeter BMPs that may be involved. I certainly won't have time today to get into those. I would say take a look at the permit requirements to fill in those gaps. But in essence, we're talking about BMPs that were installed as a result of 1 acre of disturbance. Anything that would have been installed as part of the NPDES requirements for construction for new stormwater. And that's really, it goes back to 2003 and beyond. So that 2003 date is really going to be important for you. That information is readily available. I'll touch base on that a little bit. But again, we're talking about an acre of disturbance and anything that would have been installed as part of NPDES requirements. Those are going to be your focus points. Again, fill in the gaps with the regulations, but those are going to be your focal points. The next question I get is again and again, when we're talking about the BMPs, what information specifically is required? And that's going to really come down to you need to define the exact location of these BMPs. And exact location is going to be in terms of latitude and longitude, as well as the street address. So very, very basic, but that information you should already have collected, you should have defined, and it should be submitted in your annual report. The next thing you need to define is who owns the BMP and who's responsible for it with contact information. So the majority of my clients would list 10 BMPs. They would list the municipality as the owner. They would list myself as the responsible party, and then names, addresses, emails, all other contact information is provided for the municipality as well as myself. So fairly simple concept, but that's what we're looking at when we're talking about what information needs to be provided with the BMPs. Required maintenance for the BMPs also needs to be required. This is a very, very important topic, and I'm going to try not to go down too much down a rabbit hole with this topic, because there's a lot of discussion about it, and quite frankly, I have a separate presentation that I put together just to address it. But when we're talking about these BMPs, whether they were developed particularly private as part of a homeowners association, a large commercial development, everybody here may be even remotely familiar with the idea of going through the land development process, going through the MPDS process, getting approval for these basins, these stormwater features that are installed. There's an operation and maintenance agreement that's typically signed with the municipality. That's not what we're talking about. That is a separate compliance issue. So to be a little bit more clear, we can have a BMP out there. That BMP could be satisfying two separate regulatory requirements with two separate entities reviewing those requirements. So, excuse me, if you have a homeowners association, they're going to have a requirement that would fall under that municipality they would assign the O&M agreement for. I'm talking about a separate O&M required maintenance for the BMP that would comply with your MS4. So I'm ultimately talking about defining a separate O&M that you're going to submit as part of the BMP. And if you, again, you look under MCM 5 BMP3, there is a reference that required maintenance can be defined by the PA BMP manual or other resource that can be justified, which can be your consultant. So if I'm working with somebody that's listening to this presentation, we find a very large basin we would like to be able to utilize in some fashion, whether it's a pollution reduction plan or a TMDL plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to separate the O&M and make it very clear to the private property owner that we would like to go into a partnership to utilize that basin, but you're still responsible for whatever O&M agreement you have with a municipality. That we're not interested in that. That's not part of our compliance. We will develop our own separate set of O&M responsibilities for that BMP that we're going to submit as part of our MS4 compliance. And as we work through the process of that, I would sit down with the Public Works or whoever would be maintaining this facility, and we would thinking about performing the maintenance, how we're going to document it, how we're going to report on it, how we're going to demonstrate compliance if DEP or EPA comes to our municipality and wants to see that we are doing what we're reporting. We want to be very clear in how we develop that O&M. I have one particular project right now. The municipality put in a soccer field. The soccer field, for a quick description, roughly has about 75 feet around it that's flat. There's a large berm around the entire soccer field. The soccer field is the BMP. It was not put in for any other reason than to put a soccer field in. When I look at some of the O&M agreements associated with that municipality, that BMP, if it was put in for regulatory compliance under the municipality, would have to be inspected after a 3-inch storm. That would be physically impossible to inspect that BMP with that amount of rain without damaging the fields. So that's just the example I'm talking about. If I was going to use that BMP, I would develop an operation and maintenance based on the the BMP manual as well as the site conditions, and I would put together an operation and maintenance for that BMP to be submitted with my MS4 permit that was able to be actually implemented. I think sometimes the O&M under the municipalities, it can tend, or even the counties can tend to be a little cookie cutter, and that creates problems. So again, I'm going to not spend too much time on that, but that is significant, and that's something that I like to bring up. Really think about that operation and maintenance, because once you commit to it, it now becomes part of your permit, and if you don't do it, you are not in compliance. I cannot talk about that enough. Moving forward, a continuation of the required BMP documentation. Again, I'm going to go back to MCM 5, BMP 3. You need to define the BMP type. Is it a basin? Is it retention? Is it detention? Is it a roadside swale? Whatever that is, you need to define the type. And any reference or title to that type, I would pull from the BMP manual. If the BMP manual refers to a roadside swale, you're going to want to call it a roadside swale. You want to make sure your language is very consistent so there's no confusion. If your program was to be reviewed from EPA, you may have someone from outside the state reviewing it. So you really don't want to leave any language in there that's going to be open to interpretation. You want to be very direct. You don't want to leave any gaps in any language. So I recommend using the language in the BMP. And then the year installed. That I usually start with the land development approvals to find that information. Depending on how your municipality is set up, that information may be available at the local conservation district. But under a worst case scenario, you could always go to your local DEP regional office and obtain a right to know. All those MPDS permits would be available. It's going to take a lot more effort, but the information relative to when that BMP was installed is available. Again, the next item, it's listed in the general permit, is the actual inspection and maintenance activities that occurred. Again, we're not looking for some large document. It's literally explaining what actually occurs out there. And you need to ask yourself, do you have inspection reports? With those inspection reports, was there any required follow-up? Did that occur? What happened? Maintenance reports. The maintenance report needs to mirror what you submitted for your operation and maintenance. So those inspection and maintenance reports are just a regurgitation of what you're submitting. Again, you want to make it clear cut. If everything mirrors, there's no questions or concerns about what you're doing or why you're doing it. Follow-up's very important. Anything that I go out and inspect, or I go out and fill out a maintenance report, whether it's specifically noted on the bottom or whether I write it in a pen, I put if there's a follow-up required or if there's not, I make it very bold at the bottom. Compliance, no follow-up required. Again, you don't know who's reviewing this report or where they're reviewing your report when you make these submissions. You want to make it very clear that there's no reason to go back and look at that BMP. The last component that you're going to see in the permit is assessment of compliance by the permit holder. This is more or less just it's a basic statement, but what you're really doing is the person that's signing off on your annual report, can they prove on paper that these BMPs are being maintained? Can they prove in the field that these BMPs are being maintained? So these are can be very difficult questions to answer if you don't have your documentation correct. And if I'm coming in to assess your program, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to want to say, okay, you've submitted these 10 BMPs. I have all this information. Prove to me in the office with your paperwork that you're doing what you said you're going to do. Now let's go out in the field and take a look. And with programs like Google Earth, I can upfront inspect some of your BMPs by doing a street walkthrough. So that's very important. I can inspect BMPs at least superficially in Washington State from my computer. When I have a different regulatory hat on, when I'm doing zoning, somebody tells me they put a shed in prior to my zoning ordinance, I can go on Google Earth and search history, and I can get a visual picture to see if that is correct or not. So, you know, the not that the inspectors or the regulators are coming out to beat anybody up. They're looking for compliance. And if I'm assigned a county with 60 municipalities, the first thing I'm going to do is use Google Earth to figure out where my efforts are going to be best spent. So just keep that in mind. I'm getting close on time here. Going to try to move through this a little quicker. The second item that I wanted to discuss is the procedure that I use for verifying private BMP compliance. And this procedure is not from the perspective of I enter the basin, I look at the riprap. You know, that information is readily available. What my intent today was to really provide you with a starting point, because I know most permit holders, at least up until the last 5-year permit cycle, the focus has really been on identification, all the information that I just went through. The focus now moving forward when the regulators come out is really have the public BMPs been inspected. At this point, everybody's comfortable with it. Now the focus is private. So I'm going to outline what I've done, what's worked for me, and hopefully provide a little perspective for everybody, and can really set you off on the path of developing your own procedure. So the first thing, you got to issue a notification letter. You have all the property owners identified, you know who's responsible, you have the addresses. The first question that you really need to answer is, do the property owners know? When I purchased my home in 2006, I have an infiltration facility in the rear yard. I was blown away how quickly the realtors and different folks went through that information and made me sign off on it. My wife had no idea when we signed off on it. And when I told her, it was very minimal O&M, but she was very surprised. And that's my concern, that that's going on over and over. It's certainly not going to sell homes by people listing O&M requirements for BMP. So a lot of times these are just skated over, particularly if it's not a new home, it's a person-to-person sale. So really what I'm trying to achieve is, do the property owners know? I'm going to issue a letter, and that letter is going to be more of a courtesy letter as opposed to a cease and desist. Remember, this is your first contact. When we start dialogue, raising your voice with somebody never creates a good dialogue situation. So you don't want to have a lot of stern language in this letter, and I never add it. I keep my letters to 1 page if possible. Anything longer than that, they're going to lose interest, and I make sure that the language that I use is very basic. If my mechanic was sending me a letter about my catalytic converter, I'm going to need some basic language. Not because I'm not intelligent, because I don't work in that field, and technical terms are going to do nothing for me. So just keep that in mind. It's not that you're sending out letters to people that are uneducated. They're just not knowledgeable in what we do. So you're going to develop your letters in that fashion. So the next part of this, you know, what do we include in the letters? And what I include is, again, non-technical discussion, the fact that this is part of a permit requirement, but I really try to focus in my explanation of tying that BMP into issues within the municipality. If you have flooding on First Street, if you have certain stormwater issues, if there are certain creeks that flood certain portions of town, it's better to tie this letter into that so people can understand they're maintaining these BMPs in order to retain water to alleviate problems that they know are occurring in their community. So it's going beyond the permitting, and that's really what you want to focus on. Next is defining the responsibilities. Again, keep it simple. Back to the previous point. But if I have a retention facility in my yard, just tell me in layman terms what I need to do. And that's really what I do. I provide most municipalities that I work with, even larger ones, you may have half a dozen BMPs. So it's very easy to define this information. Then you have it. It's easy to continue and provide that information moving forward. The next thing I do in the letter is I provide a means to ask questions. I provide a date, a phone number, and a place. I may show up at the municipal office and be there for a half a day, June the 5th. I may also provide evening hours at the municipality, June the 5th from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Again, you want to provide a means, a time, and a place for people to funnel all of their questions, because they will have questions, and your front desk people are going to be forwarding calls. It'll just turn into a mess. Unfortunately, I learned that the hard way, so I cannot focus on that enough. Provide a means for people to ask questions. Again, note the fact that it is compliance, so there is a deadline, but present it as a goal, not a, I need this or this is going to happen. We want to get all this information by this date, so then we can start working on X, Y, Z. So again, you're talking about compliance, but you're presenting it as a goal. And finally, the last thing that's the most difficult is really the verification. I mean, if we're sending this letter out, we're letting you know what the requirement is, we're providing you with a means to perform the O&M. The back part of this is verifying the O&M is being completed. Now, certainly anybody on this call, any municipality has the ability to do that on their own, and many have in other states. I'm taking it more from the perspective that you are asking the property owners to do the maintenance, provide some type of verification that you can submit, and then there would be periodic follow-up. The other part of this would be letting the property owner know that there's a blanket waiver or there's an access that's associated with the BMP. You will be inspecting the BMPs between these dates. I usually have my municipalities pick 2 weeks. For the municipal folks here, it sort of follows a rental inspection. You kind of group them all together and you get them all done. But either way, there has to be a verification. If you do the inspections, you can create the verification sheets. If you're going to have the private property owners, certainly the easiest way to do it is online. If you have the ability, I could log into your website. There could be a check sheet. I log into there could be a heading, private BMP holders. I could click on that. It could say the type of BMP. I could click on that. I could fill out my name and address. There could be a check sheet. I could check all these items, signature, sign, boom, we're done. We've done the verification. There should be a municipal follow-up, but we've met the permit requirements. In the event you don't have that, now we're talking about a paper trail. So there may be an extra paper that gets sent along with that information. That paper, again, would be a checklist. They would sign off. They would send it back. That information would then be collected and submitted as verification that the O&M is annually occurring on the private BMPs. Again, it's really up to everybody on here whether you want to take on that challenge or whether you want to try to go through the clerical process of shuffling the paperwork around to get the private citizens to do it. I've done it both ways, but both ways have always started with this letter. Finally, you need to figure out how you're going to address noncompliance. And I'll touch on this a little bit more. I'm getting short on time here. But do you have an ordinance in place? Was it approved under an O&M agreement? What means of enforcement do you have? In lieu of a mean of enforcement, I have sent them out anyway and have gotten some positive response back. But if you're thinking about taking it to the level of enforcement, you're going to need a means of enforcement. And that in itself is another presentation. So I won't touch too much on that other than to say what I have adopted for other municipalities has followed the zoning protocols. So I have really extracted all the requirements from enforcement from zoning, have swapped out the word zoning and put in stormwater or BMP or something of that nature, and then followed that, because I know that that is a legal means and legal procedures for me to take somebody before a local district justice if I need to perform an enforcement action. So that's the quick and dirty means from my end. If you have an ordinance in place or there's an O&M agreement, certainly those are going to be the other means, but you're going to need some means if you are getting into an enforcement. Do not misunderstand me. You can still send the letter out. You can still list the requirement. You're really not getting into the need to have that supporting legal documentation unless you are going to go before a district justice and initiate an enforcement action. So again, just to step back a little further to the notification letters, the sole purpose behind the notification letters is to figure out who's going to play ball. As a person that manages MS4 programs, When we're talking about private BMPs, let's just say I have 100 of them. Right off the bat, I need to know who's going to play ball. I issue 100 letters. I may get 25 letters back with the verification listed. Boom, those are taken care of. I may have 50 of those property owners. We come in, we have a discussion. There may be some going back and forth, but basically I've got 75 out of the 100 that were playing ball. The last 25, I've got no response. That's going to be a little bit more difficult. That is exactly what I'm reporting as part of my annual report for MS4. And I'm listing it just like that. Now, keep in mind, the 50 that you're going back and forth with and the 25 that you've got no response, you're still required to verify that compliance. So you're going to be providing updates constantly. For those 50 and those 25, I would probably recommend maybe doing a drive-by, somehow accessing the property so you can verify that compliance, because it is a requirement. But if you're looking at getting the property owners to do it, this is sort of the back and forth that you're going to do. And then that would be reported every year. If there's additional BMPs that are added, that would get added to your database. So again, the first year you do this, I look at it as who's going to play ball. You may get lucky if you're a smaller municipality and you may get 100% compliance or 95% compliance. And you may not even run into an enforcement situation, but a lot of it's going to depend on how the letter's sent out, and then the information flow that you're going to have with people when they need to ask questions. That's ultimately going to dictate how difficult of a process this is going to be. And I've seen both. I've had both across the board. I've had BMPs that are associated with Norfolk Southern Railroad. I've sent Norfolk Southern Railroad a cease and desist letter, and I'm sure they laughed and threw it away. But the reality is, if somebody calls me on the carpet for that client and asks me what I did and why I did it, I can tell you that I sent a cease and desist order to the railroad. I didn't get anywhere with it, but I need to demonstrate that I've done everything that I can do to verify compliance. And at the end of the day, that's all anybody can ask. And that's really all that the regulators want. They want you to work with them, and they want to see that you're consciously making an effort to do these things. And I promise you, if you can demonstrate that, you will not have issues with DEP. You will not have issues with EPA. They have been a tremendous help to me. And hopefully a lot of this information that I'm providing today is a product of working with those regulatory agencies. So finally, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm about 3 minutes over where I wanted to be, but consider your tracking mechanism. This is going to be a big one. And we're really talking about compliance and non-compliance. And I thought I'd provide a couple brief examples to give people an idea. Procedurally, when I started a lot of this with the private BMPs, I sort of followed a BCO or a building code official or a zoning official protocol tracking of permits. That's how I tracked the maintenance on the BMP. So I had records, we had follow-ups. If any municipalities here, that zoning protocol is very good for the paper trail. If you're a larger municipality, a larger permit holder, it's going to be more difficult due to the paper. With those clients, usually we use a database. Our GIS department head works with me. We partner as part of our MS4 team, and a lot of the information that we do BMP-wise is in a database. For the public works people here, think of a road database or a sign inventory. You have those databases. We do the same thing with BMPs. And an excellent resource. If you're ever thinking about GIS, it's excellent because you can utilize it for something like stormwater, but it has a variety of other abilities as well. But it's a very easy way to keep track of everything. Your public works folks can have like iPads or anything like that in the field. They can update information live. It's very easy to print out information. It really manages the BMPs for you and lets you know when there's going to be a problem. We'll let you know if there's non-compliance. You can issue the letter. So there's a variety of things you can do with the database, and certainly the folks with the larger, I have one municipality that has upwards of 2,000, so that's all GIS based. And finally, I'll just leave it with the enforcement actions. Unfortunately, that is going to be absolutely the last thing that you want to do, but you may have to do it. So again, I would recommend reaching out to your BCOs, reaching out to your zoning officers, the protocols that they utilize, just how they interact with people. Number one, they're going to be fantastic resources for dealing with the people in your municipality. And number two, they're going to be able to outline the appropriate way to move forward. Because when we're talking about getting residents in front of a judge, there is going to be, a little bit of maneuvering that needs to occur in order to demonstrate you've done everything that you can on your end, that you're just, this is not the Wild West, and you're just calling people on the carpet in order to not to have to go through the processes we're talking about today. So I don't want to get too much into that, because again, that's another area that you can quickly go down a rabbit hole. But keep in mind, enforcement actions may not be a highlighted topic right now, but it certainly will be moving forward as the permit cycles increase. So at this point, I have about 5 minutes. I'm sorry, I went about 5 minutes over what I wanted to do. If there's any questions now, I'd be more than happy to address those.
Yeah, Mark, we have two questions in the chat. So the first one is, how are BMP failures due to lack of O&M addressed?
Those are tricky. I'm dealing with one right now. If it's more than an acre of disturbance, check with your conservation district. They may let you do the maintenance without getting any type of MPDS permit, but that may trigger it. Failures are just looked at as repairs. The one that I'm working on right now, a basin filled up with sediment and the spillway failed. We basically required that property owner to go out, get a professional. They redesigned it, provided an engineer seal that it was designed in accordance with the standards for that engineering practice, and then they did the repair. So it was very basic. They got a stormwater permit from the municipality. We issued that, but unfortunately that fell back on the property owner and did cost a substantial amount of money in order to remedy that issue. Second question.
Yep. Can you give some examples of what has been elevated to an enforcement action?
We've had mainly probably homeowners associations that had large basins, particularly older basins that were put in very early in the NPDS program. Those basins had not been maintained. It ended up resulting in discharges through the spillway. Those discharges through the spillway sent concentrated flow onto an adjoining property owner. That was a violation of that municipality's stormwater ordinance. We sent a cease and desist letter to address the issue. There was a going back and forth. We documented all the correspondence, but eventually we had to take that homeowners association to court. We presented the original O&M that was required when the NPDS permit and the municipality approved it. And then we provided the O&M that we expected to occur to address the issue. And the judge did approve us to go in and do that work if the municipality, or I'm sorry, if the homeowners association didn't do it. So we really left the court that day with the idea of this stuff was not done within, I believe it was 90 days, then the municipality was going to go in and then lien the property or seek those dollars. So that was one scenario. Some of the other scenarios have been very simple. Stormwater pipes that disconnected from outfall structures. Municipality had to go in and just demonstrate that this was not functioning correctly. It created a health and safety issue. There was going to be additional erosion. Quite simply, we took pictures of it. We took pictures of the approved plan and presented those to a judge. And then those folks had to come in, basically regrout the structure in place. So those were some of the examples. Usually they're associated with some type of a failure. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know which way to look at it, is a judge wants to see that there's something occurring if there's going to be some type of a finding. So usually we're being retroactive when it comes into an enforcement. If there is the potential, I think that you're going to spend a little bit more time going back and forth in order to demonstrate a judge that there should be an enforcement, even though there hasn't been any damage that resulted. So hopefully that answers that. Any other questions? I think I'm exactly at 10 after. I don't know if I get cut off immediately or not.
Could go for one more if there's any other pressing questions. Otherwise, we'll be moving on. We'll get a few minutes to regroup and we'll move on to the next session. Not seeing any come in.
Okay, with no more questions, thanks again. I apologize for how quickly this information was provided. Hopefully I provided a little bit of insight. And again, if anybody has any additional questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mark.
All right, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
So again, as all the others, it's best to go ahead and leave this session. Our next topic is BMP case studies. It will be introduced by Shauna Stevens at 11:15. So it's best to leave this session, go back to the agenda and click on the link there for the introduction to BMP case studies. I will see you all there. Thank you.